Case 1. Edward Shue. Christmas Eve, 1945. A house is on fire in Fayetteville, West Virginia. A family scrambles out into the cold night air. A father, a mother, some of their children, but 5 of the kids never make it out. 5 children, gone. And when investigators sift through the ashes the next morning, they find almost nothing. No remains, no proof, no answers. That family would spend the rest of their lives refusing to believe what they were told. They put up a billboard on a West Virginia highway. Photographs of 5 missing children, a plea to anyone who might know something. And they left it standing for years. Decades, because some questions don't let you rest. But here's the thing. That case, as haunting as it is not even the most disturbing story on this list. Tonight we are going deep into West Virginia. 10 cases. 10 stories that shook this state to its core. A ghost that helped send a man to prison. A nurse who walked hospital hallways with a syringe and a secret. A man who used newspaper ads and the loneliness of strangers to build himself a killing operation. And cases so cold, so unresolved, that the families are still waiting. This is Beneath the Silence. And if you're new here, welcome. You picked the right night to show up. Before we go any further, where are you watching from right now? Drop your city and state in the comments below. I want to know who's up late with me tonight. All right, let's get into it. Greenbrier County, West Virginia, 1897. Picture it. Not the West Virginia of highways and news alerts and cell phones. The West Virginia of dirt roads and oil lamps and communities so isolated that what happened inside a home often stayed inside a home. Death was common. Explanations were not always required. And a young woman dying unexpectedly while tragic, was not always treated as a reason to start asking hard questions. That is the world Zona Heister Shue lived in, and that is the world that almost let her killer walk free. Zona was a young woman living in Greenbrier County with her husband, Edward Shue. By all outward appearances, she was simply a wife in a rural community, living the kind of quiet life that left little trace in the historical record. She was not famous, she was not powerful. She was ordinary in the way that most people are ordinary, known to the people around her, invisible to everyone else. And then, one day in January of 1897, she was found dead inside her home. A young boy who had been sent to the house to do an errand discovered her body lying at the bottom of the stairs. He ran for help, and from that moment forward, the case began moving in a direction that should have raised immediate alarm. But didn't. Not at first. When the local doctor arrived to examine Zona's body, her husband, Edward, was already there. And Edward Shue was behaving strangely. He had already moved the body, he had dressed her himself, which was unusual. He had placed a high collar and a scarf around her neck. Details that would later become deeply significant. And when the doctor attempted to examine her, Edward hovered. He was emotional, yes, but his emotion had an edge to it. He was protective of the body in a way that made people uncomfortable. He did not want anyone looking too closely at his wife's neck. The doctor, perhaps influenced by Edward's presence, perhaps simply limited by the standards of rural medicine in the 1890s, recorded the cause of death as everlasting faintness. And later, childbirth complications. Zona was buried. The community moved on, and Edward Shue, a man who had already been married twice before Zona, went about his life. That should have been the end of it. But Zona's mother, Mary Jane Heister, was not finished. Mary Jane had never trusted Edward Shue. She had opposed the marriage, and when her daughter died under circumstances that felt wrong to her, a young, healthy woman gone suddenly with a husband who seemed more concerned with controlling the scene than with grieving, she refused to accept the official explanation. Then came the part of this story that no one expected. Mary Jane Heister later claimed that her daughter's ghost appeared to her. Not once, 4 times. She said Zona came to her in the night and told her the truth. That Edward had attacked her in a rage over a piece of meat. That he had grabbed her by the neck, and that he had broken it. Now, whether you believe in ghosts or not, and this is a true crime channel, not a paranormal one, What matters is what Mary Jane did with that information. She did not keep it to herself. She did not dismiss it as grief or a dream. She took it to the prosecutor. She pushed. She demanded that someone look again at how her daughter had died. And because of that pressure, authorities agreed to exhume Zona's body. The second examination changed everything. This time, with Edward Shue not standing over the body controlling the room, investigators were able to conduct a proper autopsy. What they found was not everlasting faintness. What they found was not a complication of childbirth. Zona Shue's neck was broken. Her windpipe had been crushed. The ligaments in her neck showed clear signs of trauma. This was not a natural death. This was a homicide. Edward Shue was arrested and put on trial for the murder of his wife. At trial, the ghost story became the most famous part of the case, and it almost overshadowed the actual evidence. Mary Jane Heaster was called to testify, and she stood by every word of what she claimed to have experienced. The defense tried to use her ghost story against her, hoping to make her look unstable or delusional. It didn't work. Mary Jane was steady, she was clear. And the jury was not ultimately deciding whether ghosts were real. They were deciding whether the physical evidence supported murder. It did. Edward Shue was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. He died behind bars in 1900, maintaining his innocence until the end. And here is where the case splits into two stories that have lived side by side ever since. In one version, this is a straightforward homicide case. A woman killed by her husband, initially failed by a system that didn't look closely enough, but ultimately given justice through persistence and proper forensic examination. In that version, Mary Jane Heaster is not a woman who spoke to a ghost. She is a mother who refused to stop fighting for her daughter, and whose pressure forced the investigation that should have happened from the beginning. In the other version, the one that has been passed down through Appalachian communities for over a century, Zona Shue came back from the dead to name her killer. And in that version, justice was not just legal, it was supernatural. Both versions have survived, both versions are still told, and that is exactly why this case has outlasted almost every other murder story from its era. A dead woman, a grieving mother, and a ghost story that actually worked. The Greenbrier ghost is not just a piece of West Virginia history. It is one of the only cases in American legal history where a ghost's testimony, or at least a mother's account of one, is credited with helping bring a killer to justice. Whether the ghost was real or not, the result was. And in Greenbrier County, they haven't forgotten. There is a historical marker. There are tours. There are books and documentaries and retellings that keep finding new audiences. Because this case lives in that rare space where true crime and folklore become impossible to separate, and where the line between what is real and what is believed stops mattering quite as much as the outcome. Zona Shue got justice. Over 120 years later, people are still talking about how. Case 2, the Sodder Children Mystery. Christmas Eve is supposed to be the warmest night of the year, not in temperature, in feeling. It is the night families pull inward toward each other, toward the particular comfort of being home and together and safe. Children go to bed with anticipation instead of dread. Parents stay up a little later. The house feels full in a way it doesn't on ordinary nights. There is food. There is light. There is the specific kind of happiness that comes from knowing that tomorrow is going to be something special. That is the night the Sodder family had in Fayetteville, West Virginia on December 24th, 1945. And then sometime in the early hours of Christmas morning, their house caught fire. George and Jenny Sodder escaped. Several of their children made it out. They ran from the burning house into the cold night air, disoriented and desperate, the way people do when survival overtakes everything else. And in the chaos of those first terrible minutes, the assumption formed. The assumption that would define the next several decades of this family's life. That the 5 children who had not come out of the house had died inside it. That assumption was never proven. When investigators sifted through the ashes of the Sodder home in the days that followed, They expected to find what fire always leaves behind: remains, evidence, physical proof that 5 children had perished in the blaze. What they found instead was almost nothing. No remains that could be conclusively identified as belonging to the missing children. No bones, no clear physical evidence of death. For most families, the official conclusion would have been enough: a terrible fire, a tragic loss, grief, and eventually a painful kind of acceptance. But George and Jenny Sodder were not most families, and the absence of physical evidence was not the only thing that felt wrong. The ladder that George had planned to use to reach the upper windows of the house, the ladder that might have allowed him to get to the children, was missing from where it should have been. The phone lines had been cut. The fire itself behaved strangely, burning with an intensity and a speed that some people found difficult to attribute to an ordinary household fire. And the local fire chief's initial assessment, that the children had burned beyond recognition, and did not satisfy a family that had found almost nothing in the ashes to support that conclusion. The Sodders began to believe something else had happened. Not a tragic accident. Something deliberate, something that involved the fire as a cover, not a cause. And the theory that took hold, the one that would consume the rest of their lives, was that their 5 children had not died in that fire at all, that they had been taken. Then came the sightings. Over the years, people came forward claiming to have seen the Sodder children, or people who resembled them, alive and in other locations. A woman at a hotel. A man who claimed to have seen the children being driven away. A photograph sent to the family decades later showing a young man who bore a striking resemblance to one of the missing boys, with a note on the back that has never been fully explained. Each of these details added another layer to a mystery that was already almost impossible to untangle. And then there was the billboard. George and Jenny Sodder erected a billboard along a West Virginia highway. On it were photographs of their 5 missing children, a description of what had happened, and a plea for information. They offered a reward. They kept that billboard standing for years. It became one of the most haunting images in American true crime history. Not because of what it showed, but because of what it represented. A family that refused to grieve. A family that chose hope over closure, even when hope cost them everything. A public declaration that said, "We are still looking. We will not stop." The theories have never been resolved. Was it a tragic fire that left behind less physical evidence than expected, and a family whose grief transformed into an inability to accept the truth? Was it something more sinister? A kidnapping staged behind the cover of flames? Was there a connection to organized crime, as some researchers have suggested, rooted in a dispute George Sodder had with a local figure in the months before the fire? No one knows, and that uncertainty is precisely why this case crossed from local tragedy into national obsession. It has everything the imagination needs to keep working. Fire, missing children, Christmas night, a grieving family, suspicious details, and a question that has never been answered. The Sodder family never stopped looking, and in a way, neither has America. Case 3. Rita Mays. Walk into any VA medical center in this country and you will notice the same things. The quiet hum of medical equipment, the squeak of shoes on linoleum floors, the smell of antiseptic and cafeteria food mixing in the hallways, nurses moving between rooms with purpose, monitors beeping in steady rhythms. A controlled environment built around one central promise, that the people inside these walls are being taken care of. Families believe that promise. They have to. When you place a loved one in a medical facility, you are making an act of trust that goes beyond paperwork and insurance forms. You are saying, "I cannot do this alone. I need people with training, with access, with the tools and the knowledge to keep this person alive. And I am trusting that those people will use everything they have to do exactly that." At the Lewis A. Johnson Vamova Medical Center in Clarksburg, West Virginia, that trust was being violated in the most deliberate way imaginable. The victims were elderly veterans, men who had served this country, who had put on uniforms, followed orders, gone to places most people will never see, and carried the weight of that service for the rest of their lives. By the time they arrived at the VA medical center, they were not soldiers anymore. They were patients, physically fragile, dependent on the institution and its staff for the most basic elements of survival. Medication, monitoring, meals, the assurance that someone was watching over them through the night. They had already given everything this country asked of them. Now they were simply trying to live out their remaining years with some measure of dignity and care. Rita Mays was a nursing assistant at the facility. She had access. She had routine. She moved through the hospital the way all staff members do, with purpose, with familiarity, with the kind of presence that does not raise alarm because it is expected. She knew the schedules. She knew the patients. She knew which rooms she could enter and when, and she knew what she could do inside those rooms without anyone immediately noticing. What she did was administer insulin to patients who did not need it and had not been prescribed it. Insulin, in the wrong hands and the wrong doses, is a weapon that leaves almost no visible trace. It does not look like violence. It does not produce the kind of evidence that immediately signals foul play. A patient in a VA hospital who dies unexpectedly is, in many cases, a patient whose death can be attributed to the natural progression of age or illness. That is exactly what made Mays's method so dangerous and so difficult to detect. She was not doing something that looked like murder. She was doing something that looked like medicine gone wrong, or like nature taking its course. The killings took place between 2017 and 2018. 7 veterans died. An 8th patient survived. And for a period of time, the deaths were not immediately connected to a single source. It was only as the pattern became impossible to ignore, as the number of unexpected deaths in certain wards during certain shifts began to draw scrutiny, that investigators started looking more closely at who had been present, who had access, and what the medical records actually showed. When the truth came out, it was devastating. 7 veterans, 7 families, 1 nursing assistant with a syringe. Mays eventually admitted responsibility. She was linked to the deaths of 7 patients and the assault of the 8th. In court, the full scale of what she had done became visible in a way that no summary can fully capture. Because each of those 7 deaths represented a person, a history, a family that had already sacrificed so much and was now being told that their loved one had been murdered in a place specifically designed to keep them safe. She was sentenced to multiple life terms. The legal system did what it was supposed to do. But sentencing does not repair the damage a case like this leaves behind. It does not restore the trust that was broken. It does not answer the question that every family member of every patient in every VA facility across the country started asking the moment this story broke. How did this happen? And could it happen again? That question is the systemic fear at the heart of the Rita Mays case. Healthcare facilities depend on oversight, on checks and balances, on monitoring systems, on the assumption that the people given access to vulnerable patients are there to help them. This case revealed how completely and how quietly that assumption can be wrong. It showed that a determined person in the right position, with the right access and the right method, can turn routine care into something predatory without triggering alarm for months. These men survived wars, they came home, they grew old, and they were killed in their hospital beds by someone they trusted. Rita Mays didn't use a weapon most people would recognize. She used access, and that's what made her so dangerous. Case 4. Jean K. Whitefeather and Donald Ray Lance. Adoption is supposed to be one of the most profound acts of care one human being can extend to another. It is the decision to look at a child who needs a home and say, "You are mine now. I will protect you. I will provide for you. I will give you what you did not have." Society holds that act in high regard for a reason. It represents something we want to believe about people. That when given the opportunity to do something genuinely good, they will. This case alleged the opposite. Jean K. Whitefeather and Donald Ray Lance were a couple who had adopted children and eventually settled in West Virginia. From the outside, the picture was one of a family, adults, children, a property, a life being built. That is the image adoption is supposed to produce: a household, a structure, a sense of belonging for children who had already experienced instability. What prosecutors would later allege in court was something that bore no resemblance to that image. The case began to unravel the way many hidden crimes do, not from the inside, but from the edges. Neighbors grew alarmed. The details that filtered out from the property did not add up. Something felt wrong in the way that things sometimes feel wrong before anyone can articulate exactly why. A child seen in circumstances that didn't make sense. Behavior that raised questions, a household that seemed to operate by rules no one outside it fully understood. When those concerns reached law enforcement and authorities responded, what they encountered on the property shifted the investigation immediately. Among the most disturbing details to emerge was the alleged use of a shed, a structure on the property where children were reportedly confined. That detail alone sent a visible shock through public perception of the case. A shed, not a bedroom, not a living space, a shed. The implication of that word in this context, what it suggested about how these children were regarded, what it said about the conditions they were allegedly living in, landed hard and did not let go. The investigation that followed was extensive. As law enforcement dug deeper, the scope of what was alleged expanded. This was not a case of one incident or one moment of cruelty. The picture that emerged through the investigation and eventually through court testimony described a sustained pattern. Children subjected to conditions and treatment that prosecutors characterized as deliberate, systemic, and in some dimensions racially motivated. The racial dimension of the case added another layer of outrage to an already explosive story. Allegations that the mistreatment was connected in part to the racial identities of the children involved pushed the case beyond the category of domestic abuse and into territory that felt to many observers like something even more calculated and dehumanizing. Forced labor allegations compounded that further. The idea that children in this household were not just neglected or mistreated but allegedly put to work in ways that stripped them of any semblance of a normal childhood. When the case went to trial, public attention was intense. This was not a story people were following from a distance with mild curiosity. They were watching it the way people watch something they cannot look away from. Because the details were too disturbing, the betrayal too complete, the gap between what adoption is supposed to mean and what this case alleged too wide to ignore. Court development spread quickly. Testimony from the children, evidence gathered from the property, and the sheer volume of charges kept the case in constant public conversation. The guilty verdicts, when they came, were met with a reaction that mixed relief with the particular exhaustion that follows a case like this. The kind of exhaustion that comes not from following a story too long, but from confronting what the story revealed about what human beings are capable of doing to children in their care. Society treats adoptive parenting as an act of love. This case turned that idea inside out. It took something the public associates with generosity and sacrifice and showed what it looks like when that role is used as cover for control, cruelty, and exploitation. It showed how the language of family can be weaponized, how the appearance of care can conceal the reality of harm, and how long that concealment can last when a household is isolated enough and the people inside it are vulnerable enough. This wasn't a cold case from another era. This was happening, right now, in West Virginia, and people were watching. Case 5, Kennedy Miller. What does it take for a child to fall through every crack at once? It is not a rhetorical question. It is the question that sits at the center of this case and refuses to move. Because when you look at what happened to Kennedy Miller, when you look at the details, the timeline, the people involved, the systems that existed around her, the answer is not simple. And that is exactly what makes this case so difficult to sit with. Kennedy Miller was 14 years old. She lived in Boone County, West Virginia. And in 2024, her death became one of the most talked about and most disturbing cases the state had seen in years. Not because of a stranger, not because of a random act of violence, but because of what allegedly happened inside the walls of her own home. at the hands of the people who were supposed to love her most. When authorities responded to the situation involving Kennedy, what they encountered stopped them cold. She was found in a condition that investigators and medical professionals described as severely emaciated. The details that emerged in the days and weeks that followed were the kind that people struggle to process. Not because they are hard to understand, but because they are hard to accept. A 14-year-old girl. A condition that did not develop overnight. A level of physical deterioration that spoke to something prolonged, something sustained, something that had been happening for a long time before anyone with the power to stop it intervened. That timeline is the part that haunts people most. Her mother was indicted. Her grandparents were indicted. The people charged in connection with her death were not strangers who broke into her life from the outside. They were the architecture of her life. The people she woke up to every morning. The people who controlled what she ate, where she slept, whether she received medical attention, whether anyone outside that home ever got close enough to see what was happening inside it. When charges like these are filed against family members, the public reaction tends to move through a specific sequence. First, disbelief, then anger, then almost inevitably the question that transforms a criminal case into a social conversation. How did this happen without anyone knowing? And that is where this case expanded beyond one household in Boone County and became something much larger. Child welfare systems exist precisely for situations like this. Oversight mechanisms, mandatory reporting laws, school attendance requirements, medical check-ins. These are the structures society builds to create visibility into the lives of children who cannot advocate for themselves. They are imperfect. They are underfunded in many places. They rely on human beings making judgment calls under pressure with incomplete information. But they exist. And when a child dies in the way Kennedy Miller died, the first question people ask about those systems is not whether they existed. It is whether they worked. Were there prior concerns? Were there reports filed? Were there teachers, neighbors, relatives, or community members who saw something that didn't sit right and either said something or didn't? Were there moments when the system came close enough to intervene and pulled back? Those questions became part of the public conversation around this case almost immediately. Because the outrage people felt was not directed only at the individuals charged. It was directed at the entire environment that allowed a 14-year-old girl to reach that condition without being reached first. That is what made the reaction to Kennedy Miller's death so intense and so widespread. People were not just mourning a child, they were confronting a fear, the fear that the systems designed to protect the most vulnerable among us can fail completely, quietly, and for long enough that by the time anyone looks, it is already too late. The case is still moving through the legal process. Charges have been filed. The judicial system is doing what it does. But the conversation the case started, about oversight, about intervention, about what it means to be responsible for a child's safety, that conversation did not wait for a verdict. It started the moment the story broke, and it has not stopped since. Could this have been stopped? That is the question that haunts every person who has followed this case. And the honest answer is that we may never know for certain. What we do know is that it wasn't. This wasn't just a crime. It was a failure, and the difference between those two things is the part that keeps people awake. What's the weather like where you are tonight? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. Case 6, the Huntington prom night homicides. There is a specific kind of anticipation that only exists on prom night. It builds for weeks beforehand. The dress picked out and hung carefully in a closet. The photographs planned, the corsages ordered, the limousines booked. Parents stand in living rooms with cameras trying to freeze a moment they already know is passing too fast. Kids who have spent 4 years becoming who they are walk out the front door looking like the people they are about to become. It is one of those rare American rituals that carries genuine emotional weight. Not just for the teenagers living it, but for everyone around them. Prom night is supposed to be a memory, the good kind. The kind people carry for the rest of their lives and pull out at reunions and family dinners and quiet moments when they are feeling nostalgic. It is supposed to represent the last exhale of youth before everything gets more complicated. That is what makes what happened in Huntington so devastating. Not just the crime itself, but the collision. The violent, irreversible collision between everything prom night is supposed to mean and everything that actually happened. Huntington, West Virginia is a city with its own identity, its own history, its own community rhythms. And like every community, it had its rituals. The school year, the seasons, the events that marked time and gave people shared reference points. Prom was one of those events. It was supposed to come and go the way it always did, leaving behind photographs and stories and the particular bittersweet feeling of a chapter closing. Instead, it left behind a crime scene. The killings that became known as the prom night homicides shocked Huntington in a way that the city did not quickly recover from. Young victims. A celebratory setting turned violent. The kind of case that does not stay contained to a police report or a courtroom. It bleeds into the community's memory and stays there. People who were not directly connected to the victims still felt it, because in a community, a crime like this does not just happen to the people it happens to. It happens to the idea of safety. It happens to the assumption that certain nights, certain places, certain moments are protected by their own innocence. That assumption did not survive prom night in Huntington. And here is where the name itself becomes part of the story. The prom night homicides. Say it out loud and notice what it does. It is not a neutral description. It is a collision of two worlds and four words. The celebration and the violence, the ritual and the rupture. Names like that do not get attached to cases by accident. They get attached because they capture something true about the emotional reality of what happened. And once a name like that takes hold, it changes how an entire community remembers a period of time. People stopped saying "remember prom" and started saying "remember what happened on prom night." That shift is permanent. It cannot be undone. The celebration and the crime are now inseparable in the memory of everyone who lived through it. The photographs from that night exist in two registers at once. Joy and dread, before and after, innocence and the end of it. The victims were young. That is the detail that sits heaviest. Young people with plans, with futures that had barely started to take shape. With families who had stood in living rooms that very evening, cameras in hand, trying to hold on to a moment. Those families did not get the memory they were supposed to get. They got something else entirely. Something no parent should ever have to carry. In true crime, symbolism is often what separates a tragic case from a famous one. Severity alone does not make a case unforgettable. What makes a case unforgettable is when it captures something larger than itself, and when it becomes a symbol of something the public already fears or values or mourns. The Huntington prom night homicides became a symbol of stolen youth, of a night that promised everything and delivered the worst possible thing instead. Some crimes are remembered for what they did. This one is remembered for what it destroyed. Don't leave yet. The next three cases are the ones that genuinely kept me up at night researching this. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what's coming next on this channel. Case 7. Vicky Durian and Nancy Santomero. There is something about the open road that carries a specific kind of freedom. Movement, possibility. The feeling that you are between one place and another, untethered for a moment from everything that normally holds you in place. For two women traveling through West Virginia in 1980, that road represented exactly that. Motion, independence, the ordinary adventure of going somewhere. They never arrived. Vicky Durian and Nancy Santomero were two young women whose lives, like most lives, were made up of the kinds of details that matter enormously to the people who love them and leave almost no trace in the public record. They had people who knew them, people who expected them, people who would spend years, decades, trying to understand what happened on a road in West Virginia and why no one has ever been held accountable for it. That is the wound at the center of this case, and it is never closed. When their bodies were discovered, the immediate reality of a double homicide changed the entire weight of the investigation. A single murder is devastating. A double murder is something else. It signals a killer who was not acting out of panic or impulse alone. Or if they were willing to go further than most people can imagine. It raises the stakes of every question investigators ask. It doubles the number of families waiting for answers. And it creates a specific kind of public fear because two victims means the danger was not contained to one moment or one target. It spread. The road element made everything more complicated. When victims are travelers, people moving through a place rather than rooted in it, the investigative geography expands dramatically. Who saw them last? At what point did their journey go wrong? Did someone follow them? Did they stop somewhere and trust the wrong person? Did they accept help from someone who offered it with bad intentions? Were they targeted specifically, or were they simply in the wrong place at the wrong moment? Those questions are not rhetorical. They are the actual architecture of the investigation, and in this case, none of them produced a definitive public answer. The road gave the killer something that a crime in a fixed location might not have: movement, distance, and the ability to disappear back into the world before anyone knew what had happened. Two timelines, two women with their own histories, their own reasons for being on that road, their own people waiting for them. And one act of violence that collapsed both timelines into a single unsolved case that has now stretched across more than 4 decades. Cases like this develop a particular gravity in cold case circles. They resurface not because new evidence has broken them open, but because the injustice of them refuses to settle. Researchers revisit them. Investigators pull the files again. True crime communities dissect the details, looking for the thread that everyone else missed. The Durian and Santomero case has that quality. The feeling that the answer is somewhere, that it has always been somewhere, and that the right combination of attention and information could still bring it forward. That feeling is both the hope and the torment of an unsolved double homicide. It keeps people engaged. It keeps families from fully letting go. It keeps the names alive in conversations that might otherwise have moved on. But hope and torment are not justice, and justice is what this case has never delivered. How does someone do this and disappear? How does a case this visible stay unsolved? How do two families live with that? There are no clean answers to those questions. There never are in cases like this. What there is instead is the record. 2 names, 1 crime, and a silence that has lasted long enough to become its own kind of statement. 2 women, 1 killer who walked away, and a case that refuses to go quiet. Vicky Durian and Nancy Santomero deserved better than what West Virginia gave them in 1980. They deserved an investigation that ended with a name, a trial, a verdict. Instead, their story became one of the state's most enduring open wounds. And it remains exactly that today. Case 8. Roberta E. Lam. There are places in the world that feel untouchable, not because they are protected by walls or security systems or armed guards, but because of what they represent. A convent is one of those places. It is a space built around silence, discipline, and devotion. A place where the outside world and all its violence is supposed to stay outside, where the people inside have chosen a life defined by faith, not fear. That idea that some spaces are safe by virtue of what they stand for is exactly what this case destroyed. Roberta Elam was 26 years old in 1977. She was a postulant nun, which means she was in the early stages of her religious life, still in the process of committing herself fully to that path. She was connected to Mount St. Joseph, a religious community near Wheeling, West Virginia. By every account, she was a young woman whose life was oriented around something larger than herself: prayer, service, community, faith. She was not living recklessly. She was not in a dangerous environment. She was exactly where she was supposed to be, and someone found her there anyway. Roberta Elam was sexually assaulted and murdered. The crime happened near the grounds of Mount St. Joseph, in a place that should have been among the safest in the region. And when the news spread that a young nun had been attacked and killed in a space associated with religious life, the shock was immediate and profound. It is worth pausing on why that detail matters so much to the way people receive this story. Violence is always wrong. Every victim deserves justice regardless of where the crime occurs. But there is something about the setting of this case that amplifies the horror in a specific way. When violence intrudes into a space that society has collectively agreed to treat as sacred, a church, a school, a hospital, a convent, it does not just destroy one person. It damages something in the public imagination. It takes a place that represented safety and replaces that feeling with dread. And that damage does not repair itself easily. For the community around Wheeling, the murder of Roberta Elam did exactly that. It turned a place of peace into a crime scene. And it left behind a question that investigators would spend decades trying to answer. The investigation began with urgency. A young woman was dead. The circumstances were violent. There was a crime scene, there was a victim, and there was a community demanding answers. But despite the seriousness of the case and the attention it received, the investigation stalled. No arrest was made, no suspect was publicly charged. And as the months turned into years, the case moved from active investigation into the long, frustrating territory of the unsolved. Decades passed. The world around the case changed even as the case itself did not. Forensic science advanced. DNA technology, which did not exist in any meaningful investigative capacity in 1977, became one of the most powerful tools in cold case work. And with that advancement came something the Elam case had been running low on for years: hope. Investigators and advocates held on to the possibility that biological evidence from the original crime scene might someday yield a profile, a match, a name. That hope flickered at various points over the years, but it never fully ignited. No public identification of a suspect ever came. No arrest followed. The case remained open in the technical sense and frozen in every other sense. What keeps Roberta Elam's story alive is not resolution. It is the absence of it. It is the feeling, shared by investigators, by the community, by anyone who hears the details, that this case should not still be unsolved. That a crime this visible, this emotionally charged, this wrong in every possible dimension should have produced answers by now. And yet, this is the kind of case that should have been solved. The kind that feels too wrong to stay open. And yet here we are, nearly 50 years later. Still waiting? If you're finding this documentary worth your time, hit that like button right now. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people. Okay. Back to West Virginia. Case 9. Anita Price, Marshall County, West Virginia. 1974. There is something about an abandoned car that stops people cold. It is not the car itself. It is what the car represents. A car sitting empty on the side of a road means someone was there, and then wasn't. It means a journey that started and did not finish. It means a gap between the last moment anyone can account for and everything that came after. And in most cases, that gap is where the truth lives. That gap is where Anita Price disappeared. The day she vanished was supposed to be ordinary. That is the detail that makes cases like this so deeply unsettling. Not that something dramatic happened, but that nothing about the morning suggested anything was wrong. Anita Price was a young woman in Marshall County going about her life the way she always did. She had somewhere to be. She had a routine. And routines in small communities especially are the kind of thing people notice when they break. Marshall County is not a place where people disappear without someone paying attention. It is the kind of community where neighbors know each other's schedules, where a familiar face missing from a familiar place gets noticed fast. So when Anita did not show up where she was supposed to be, the alarm did not take long to sound. And then they found the car, abandoned, left behind in a way that did not suggest a breakdown or a detour or a change of plans. The car told investigators that something had happened, but it did not tell them what. It did not tell them where Anita was. It did not tell them who, if anyone, had been with her. It just sat there, silent, the way evidence sometimes does, offering the shape of a story without filling in any of the words. Investigators began asking the questions they always ask when a car turns up without its driver. Was there a struggle? Were there signs of forced entry or a fight? Did she leave willingly or was she taken? Was the vehicle moved after the fact, staged to mislead? Was this a crime scene or just the last place she stopped? What they found gave them very little to work with. And what they didn't find, a body, a witness, a clear trail, gave them even less. Over time, law enforcement came to suspect foul play. That shift matters more than people sometimes realize. When a case moves from missing person to suspected homicide, it changes everything. It changes how investigators approach the evidence. It changes how the family processes their grief. Because suddenly they are not just waiting for someone to come home. They are waiting for justice for someone who may never come home at all. It changes the legal weight of every lead, every rumor, every person who might have seen something and stayed quiet. It also changes the community. In a small county, a suspected murder with no resolution does not fade quietly into the background. It lingers. It sits at the edges of conversations. It becomes the case people lower their voices to talk about. The one that gets brought up when someone asks about the worst things that ever happened here. Anita Price's case became that case for Marshall County. No arrest ever came. No body was ever recovered. No one was ever publicly charged with her disappearance. The years moved forward the way years do, indifferent to the questions left behind. And the case settled into that painful category of crimes that investigators call open and families call unfinished. There are no dramatic courtroom moments to describe here. No confession, no conviction, no closure. Just a young woman who left for what should have been a normal day, a car found on the side of a road, and a silence that has stretched across 5 decades without breaking. That silence is the story. Because some cases don't end. They just stop making noise. Anita Price deserves to be remembered. Not because her case was resolved, but because it wasn't. Because somewhere in Marshall County, the answer to what happened to her still exists. In someone's memory, in someone's conscience. In a detail that has never been spoken out loud. And until that changes, her name stays on the list. What time is it where you are right now? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one. Case 10. Harry Powers, widower, age 50, honest, hardworking, good provider. Seeking companionship and possibly marriage with a sincere woman of good character. Object, matrimony. Words like those appeared in newspapers across America in the late 1920s and early 1930s. Lonely Hearts advertisements. Personal columns where people reached across distance and anonymity to find connection. There was nothing unusual about them. In a world without telephones in every home, without the ability to travel freely, without any of the digital infrastructure we now take for granted, the newspaper was how people communicated across distances. It was how communities stayed connected. And for people living alone, widows, divorcees, women in rural areas with limited social circles, those personal columns represented something genuinely powerful. They represented the possibility that loneliness did not have to be permanent. Harry Powers understood that, and he used it. Powers lived in Quiet Dell, a small community near Clarksburg, West Virginia. To the people around him, he was unremarkable in the way that the most dangerous people often are. Polite, ordinary, the kind of man who did not draw attention to himself. He had a wife, he had a property, he had the appearance of a settled, respectable life. And underneath all of it, he had a system. He placed advertisements in Lonely Hearts columns under false names. He crafted the language carefully. The words of a man seeking genuine connection, offering stability, companionship, the promise of a fresh start with someone who understood what it meant to be alone. He corresponded with women across multiple states, building relationships through letters, presenting himself as exactly the kind of man a lonely woman might dare to hope for. Then he invited them to visit. The women who responded to Harry Powers were not naive. They were not reckless. They were human beings doing what human beings do, reaching toward the possibility of something better. Some were widows. Some were women raising children on their own in an era when that was an especially difficult and isolating experience. They were drawn in not by greed or desperation, but by something far more fundamental. Hope. The hope that the man on the other end of those letters was who he said he was. The hope that loneliness had an answer. It didn't. Not the one they were looking for. When investigators eventually turned their attention to Powers' property in Quiet Dell, what they found beneath the surface of that ordinary-looking piece of land was the truth that his letters had been designed to conceal. Bodies. Multiple victims. Women who had traveled to West Virginia to meet the man they had been corresponding with and had never returned home. And children, because some of these women had brought their children with them, trusting that they were traveling towards safety. The discovery exploded into national headlines almost immediately. This was not a local crime story. This was the kind of case that seized the entire country's attention. A predator operating through the mail system, using the infrastructure of human longing as his hunting ground, leaving bodies buried on a rural property while the world around him had no idea. Powers was arrested. The trial that followed was one of the most closely watched criminal proceedings of its era. Evidence mounted. The scale of what he had done became fully visible in a courtroom that the press covered with the intensity usually reserved for political events. He was convicted and eventually executed, hanged in 1932 at the West Virginia State Penitentiary. But the execution did not end the story. It never does with cases like this. Harry Powers became something beyond a convicted killer. He became a case study, a reference point, a name attached to a method of predation that did not die with him. Researchers, criminologists, and true crime historians have returned to his case repeatedly because what he did was not just violent, it was architectural. He built a system. He identified a vulnerability in the world around him, the loneliness of isolated women in an era with limited social connection. And he engineered a process to exploit it. Calculated, patient, invisible until it was too late. The tools have changed, the tactic hasn't. Today, the Lonely Hearts column is a dating app, a social media profile, a private message from someone who seems too good to be true. The distance between predator and victim has collapsed. The reach is global. But the psychological blueprint Harry Powers used in 1931 is the same one that investigators recognize in cases happening right now. Find the vulnerability. Offer what the person needs most. Build trust. Move in. He is remembered not just because he killed. He is remembered because of how he hunted. Because the lie at the center of his crimes was so perfectly constructed, so precisely aimed at something real and human and understandable that it worked. Again and again. He didn't offer violence. He offered hope. And that's the cruelest weapon of all. West Virginia is a state that people often underestimate. They think of mountains and small towns and a quieter pace of life. They do not always think of it as a place where history-making crimes unfold. But the 10 cases on this list tell a different story. They tell the story of a ghost who helped convict a murderer in 1897. A young woman who vanished on an ordinary day in 1974 and never came back. A nun killed in a sacred space, her case still open nearly 50 years later. 2 women on a road in 1980 whose killer has never faced justice. A prom night that a community has never been able to remember the right way. A 14-year-old girl who fell through every crack that was supposed to catch her. Children allegedly exploited behind the closed doors of a home that was supposed to protect them. Veterans murdered in their hospital beds by someone they had no reason to fear. 5 children who may or may not have died in a Christmas Eve fire. And a family that spent decades refusing to stop looking. and a man in quiet Dell who turned loneliness into a trap and buried the evidence in his backyard. 10 cases, 10 different kinds of darkness, and not one of them easy to forget. That is what this channel is about. Not just the crimes, but the people behind them, the people lost to them, and the questions that outlast all of it. If you made it this far, you already know what kind of channel this is. Subscribe to Beneath the Silence. New stories drop regularly, and trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. And before you go, leave a comment. Tell me which case hit you the hardest tonight. I'll be reading every single one. This is Beneath the Silence. I'll see you in the next one.